Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. For this video, I'm Dr. Frankenstein. Well, not for this video, but I'll eventually become the doctor. Eventually. Today, we're going to be looking at the Panasonic GF3. I purchased this from a popular electronic auction site. Once shipping was factored in, I paid around 125 Canadian buckaroos, roughly 90 US freedom dollars. A solid price. And I wanted to do a quick-ish video on this as I have plans for this GF3. It will not look the same after this video. There will be reconstruction. There will be probably a merger of sorts. I won't totally give up the details, but feel free to guess in the comments below what is in store for this GF3. And if all goes well or not well, I'll be making up a follow-up or follow-ups depending on the level of success. The only hint is that this will clearly be taken apart. With that, let's get into it. What is the Panasonic GF3? Well, it's this right here, and it's an entry-level mirrorless camera made by Panasonic. It was announced in June of 2011, and at the time, it was the smallest and lightest mirrorless camera that you could buy. It featured a 12.1 megapixel 4/3 size CMOS sensor, and it had an ISO range of 160 to 6400. Metering was handled by a 144 zone system, and the shutter speed is good for 60 seconds to 1/4000th of a second. Autofocus is contrast detect only, and it shoots at up to 3.8 FPS for 7 RAWs. Flash sync speed is up to 1/160th with this camera, and this camera does feature a built-in flash, but it does not have a hot shoe or a smart shoe. The rear of the camera has a 3-inch fixed position screen and has 460 K dots, and it supports touchy. The camera does shoot video, and it shoots up to 1080 60i, and it takes SD cards for memory. With a battery and an SD card, this thing comes in at 319 grams, about 0.32 plana. Back in glorious 2011, it was 499 USD. Is there any camera that you could buy for that price these days? Anyways, that comes in at a very reasonable 710 USD, or roughly 980 thimbles of maple syrup. Buying from Japan. So, as I said, I bought this from an electronic buying and selling platform of auctions. And this one was pretty cheap. And that was partly because this was a Japanese domestic product variant of the GS3, meaning that it initially only came with the Japanese language only. And, it's only supposed to have that. But, as you can see, mine is defying that with much English. So how did I do it? Well, luckily, this camera can be modded with a firmware which enables the other languages, not just English. The tool that I used to do this was PTools, and with this tool, you just needed to find the supported firmware that the program supports, which is normally downloaded from Panasonic's website, and in the program, you can enable the multiple language option. It can do other things too. It's actually normally used to do things like enable higher bit rates for video recording and other swanky things, but for the purposes of this video, I only used it to change the language settings. And, if you wanted to do that as well, in case you were thinking of also buying a Japanese domestic product, then I will link to the site FAQ down below, as there's quite a few guides on that page, as well as it tells you which cameras that are supported by the program. It's typically older cameras like G3 and below, just to, keep that in mind. There is a way to do it with other Panasonic cameras as well, but it's not quite as nice as just using this program to do a firmware dump modify it and reload it. It's a little more complicated. A little bit. Operation and feel. Let's start off with the good. This camera has a very solid feel. The build is a mix of aluminum and plastic, and it doesn't feel cheap at all, despite its entry-level status. The rear thumb perch on the camera works pretty well, and when it's paired with a small lens like this 14 millimeter pancake, it's a pretty comfy thing to hold, generally. This camera is also legitimately pretty small. It can fit into pockets. Large pockets, sure, but it still fits. And it's actually one of the reasons why I bought this thing. Overall, it's a nice, neat, small, unassuming camera. Now, since it doesn't have an EVF or composition, you gotta rely on this rear screen. And I did find that in daylight, it was generally reasonably usable. The panel is reasonably bright, although the lack of tilting does impede things a little bit. But overall, it was not a bad experience. Now, moving on, let's talk about the top panel of the camera. I found that this is a pretty well laid out system, as everything can be reached with just your index finger. And all the things you can reach are the movie record start button right here. You have your shutter button, an on-off toggle right there, and the Panasonic IA mode, which is their intelligent auto mode, and it's a toggle. Anyways, either way, the top plate stuff, pretty easy, pretty good, well designed. Right, let's talk about the less good. This is going to be a little bit longer. Where to start? Oh, let's start with the back. Well, command dials. As you can see, this camera only really has this rear combo dial, the multi-dial thingy, and it's okay. There's just so many things that this back dial thing is doing, it's not that ideal. There really could have been a command dial on the back, like right where the thumb perch is, and I get why they didn't have it there. Save money, save space, but it would have been nice if they could include it. It probably wouldn't be too bad if this camera had more dedicated buttons, but if you have a look at the back of the camera, it is a really minimal amount of buttonage. You really only have a play button up here and a Q menu over there with the multi-way dial thingy. Now, let's go back to camera design. While the metal and plastic build has a nice dense feel, the lack of a textured surface on the grippy bits actually kind of make it uncomfortable at times. The front can get quite slippery on dry days, and the bump really isn't that great. If it were textured, I think it would improve things a lot, but as it stands, I find that it's just too smooth, and if you're like using a bigger lens, you're relying on this thumb perch a lot, and it gets a bit unbalanced. Again, with pancake lenses, it's fine, but if you have like other lenses, it will be a bit weird. Now, again, back to controls, we're going to hop around a bit. Again, not a lot of buttons, which kind of means you're going to be doing quite a bit of menu diving and quite a bit of going through like pages of things. Luckily, the menu itself isn't bad. It's the Panasonic system, so it's generally pretty straightforward and there's not a huge amount of stuff. The annoying thing here, though, is the rear touchscreen. True, it does do touchy touches, but it is a single point touch only, and it's the older style resistive touch panel. So no pinchy zooms, no swipes, no gestures. It's also just kind of annoying because it's a thing that I found was kind of easy to touch, and I would constantly change my focus point to some random thingy, so I'd have to reset the focus point and recenter it. And again, because this doesn't have that many buttons, recentering the focus point was kind of annoying. And at the same time, it can be infuriatingly unresponsive because it is the older style resistive touch panel. They're really more suited for like those thin pen styluses and not chubby thumbs. Let's see if I can actuate. There, I actually managed to, did I? I did not do what I meant to do. It zoomed in, I meant to touch the A. But yeah, as you can see, it's not a great touchscreen. Oddly enough, at the time, the touch controls were pretty well regarded, but I really don't think that aged well. I found that while you can navigate your quick menu with your touchy fingers, I found it was honestly more annoying to touch them than just to use the multi-way controller. Another annoying thing about this camera is you might have noticed there is a lack of a mode selector. So changing modes requires one of two things. Either do it through the touchy touch only, which involves touching this A. Let's see if I can do it. And then touching the thing you want to go to, or using the multi-way controller and then doing 2 button presses, because you have to press and then navigate your way to the mode change, and then you can scroll and select. So several clickies, kind of annoying. One nice thing I will say about the touchscreen is that generally it at least indicates what you can and can't touch. So you can see on the back that on this row, there are options and they are flanked by a soft button interface thingy. So if you know that if you see that, you can touch it and modify it. What's kind of annoying is if you go to the menu, you can navigate to the actual menu down here, but the actual deeper menu stuff has to be done through the multi-way stuff. And while this last thing isn't a big deal, it's just kind of weird. It's ugly. The GUI design language is not very good. I forgot how old Panasonic looks, and somehow with a touchscreen, it feels older than it is. Although part of this, I think, is because I reviewed Samsung cameras a little while ago, and their GUI design languages looked great. It's kind of crazy to think that this GF3 is actually a year newer than the Samsung NX10 that I reviewed. But the NX10 menu and GUI looked like they're from 10 years after this camera. It's kind of weird. And another thing about the GUI is that it affects how I perceive the screen. The rear screen is 460K dots. Not a lot by modern standards, but honestly enough. But the font and the way that they style stuff on this screen just makes things look really jaggedy and not very nice. And it makes the screen look worse than it is. And again, it's just mainly the iconography and the animations they use, because it doesn't look very good. And it really makes the screen feel a little older than it is. Now, okay, I will end on a nice point. If you enabled histogram on this camera, you can actually change its position by touching it and dragging it around. But overall, all this basically adds up to a fairly meh shooting experience. Image quality and autofocus. Now, as I said earlier, this camera uses a 12.1 megapixel CMOS sensor, and I think it has pretty good resolving power, although it does have an AA filter in front of it, so less resolving power than modern contemporary Micro Four Thirds cameras. But honestly, I think for stills, it's perfectly sufficient. Where it does kind of fall short though, is dynamic range and noise. This camera essentially has a basically first-ish gen Micro Four Thirds sensor in it with some processing updates. Compound this with the fact that at the time when this was released, even APS-C cameras that were coming up had better dynamic range and better noise performance. And this camera, it feels a bit old, even considering its actual age. In essence, if you get this camera, you gotta expose it just right. You're not gonna have a huge amount of pushing or pulling room. And with that, let's have a look at some noise samples. at ISO 1600 or up, you really start to see that the GF3 noise gets a bit janky. There's lots of color noise, and luminance noise is coming in to steal your detail. That said, modern noise reduction in this case is very helpful with this camera at high ISOs. And when it comes to autofocus, again, this is an older contrast detect only system before Panasonic did their like super rapid DFD stuff. And the result of that is that it is not that good at tracking things. It's perfectly fine at doing static objects, and its speed I found, again, for static objects was reasonable. It's at least pretty accurate. Now, another nice thing is that you can also at least use this touchscreen to do touch to focus. So that kind of helps things a little bit. But, that being said, if for some reason you do want to track things and you do want to shoot moving objects, you get 3.8 FPS. Let's shoot a burst. Well, not bad. Anyways, you might have noticed that despite this camera's small size, the sound it makes isn't that small. It's actually quite a loud clank. But I actually don't mind that noise. It's not my favorite shutter sound, but it isn't bad. It's not my favorite shutter sound, but honestly, it isn't bad. Video mode. So this does shoot video, and it has a dedicated video button. Again, it shoots at 1080 in 60i, but the sensor is actually capable of doing 1080 30p. And again, it is contrast detect, and it applies in video as well. So expect that the video autofocus is going to be a bit jerky going back and forth. Now, oddly enough, there's no dedicated video mode, so you just hop in whatever stills mode you're in, and it's all right. You basically kind of have to guess where your framing is going to be if you're shooting video, since the 1080 ratio is not the same as the 4:3 that the camera's shooting in for stills. So, it's kind of annoying for framing, but you can get used to it. But I imagine that if you're buying this camera, you're probably not going to buy it for video anyways. But that said, I find that the 1080 out of this looks all right. Let's have a look at some of those clips. Conclusion. So I lied. This turned out to be a fuller review than I thought. But what's not a lie is that this camera may not survive on the surgical table. I may not have a success story. Maybe I will, who knows? We'll see what happens. But do I recommend the GF3? Well, if size and costs are top priority, then yes. It's fairly small and it's reasonably well built, and image quality is good enough. As I said, with a pancake lens, this is actually pretty pocketable. And the going rates are pretty agreeable at 75 USD to 150 USD, with the cheaper ones being the ones that are the Japanese only firmware. So if you don't mind playing around with that, you can get yourself a pretty cheap camera for a pretty low price. That being said, if you don't mind just a tiny bit bigger, the EPL2 I think is a much nicer shooting experience. Plus, you get iBiz. Plus, you get a hot shoe, which also has a smart shoe connector, so you could add an EVF for even more flexibility. But that being said, you could also get the Panasonic GF1 or 2. They're marginally bigger, but I personally think the ergonomics of those cameras are a little bit better. Plus, they also can take an EVF. That said, if you buy an EVF, the cost of the system overall will dramatically rise. Anyways, that is all I got for this video. Do you want to guess what will become of this GF3? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Till next time, say goodbye to this GF3 and bye.